All right, what a great morning, and we're only about 2.5 hours in, but our next guest has an impressive resume. He holds degrees in economics from Cambridge University and Harvard Kennedy School of Government, formerly with the UK Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, then Management Consulting, advising governments and companies in Asia and Africa on strategy and economic growth. He's a special advisor to the World Economic Forum. He's an author of Soul of the Sea in the Age of the Algorithm and How the Fourth Industrial Revolution Can Heal the Oceans. And he's also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Nishan Degnarain. I knew I would know.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nidhi. Good morning, and thank you, Paddy, for hosting such a wonderful event. Good morning. So I'm here to talk a little bit about planetary health, effectively the environment, and what could potentially be a large fintech opportunity. So just a little bit of context to build on Nidhi's introduction. So I'm a special advisor to the World Economic Forum. That's the group of leaders, business, government leaders, and scientists and NGOs who meet every year in the Swiss town of Davos in Switzerland. I was a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of a central bank in Mauritius setting interest rates. And most recently, I've been a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, looking at climate finance and understanding what are some of the big challenges we're facing for our planet. So this morning, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the landscape, touch a little bit on the science to understand why this is important, and then the financial scale of the economic challenge, and then some of the fintech opportunities. But to begin with, just a short video that we've used at the World Economic Forum, just to frame the challenge and bring some of this to life.
Within the next decade or so, we are going to pass a number of tipping points, beyond which it's going to be very difficult to recover.
Reckless burning of fossil fuels, the destruction of the forests, pollution of the ocean. How is it possible that the most intellectual being that ever walked the planet is destroying its only home?
Since 1970s, we lost 60% of vertebrate species. If we look at insects, we lost 80%. As we lose species, what we also lose is the capacity of the natural systems to really provide the services that allow us to function.
One of the consequences of living in great cities, in great masses, is that we are cut off from that natural world. If you lose that sense of wonder, you've lost one of the most important things in your life.
The human race produces more waste than it really should.
We only recycle 9% of all plastic. That means that unless it's been burnt, every single piece of plastic ever made still exists on our planet.
The crisis of biodiversity with climate change, it's interlocked with many other global crises that we are seeing. Migration and climate refugees, political crisis, and perhaps a moral crisis.
We've stolen our children's future, we're still stealing it, and we must get together now.
When I first started the school strike for the climate, I never would have imagined that it was going to be this big. It's over 100,000 children from all around the world.
The consumer has to be the one that forces everyone's hand to say, I will not buy from you unless you have a sustainability policy and a clear transparency on the whole supply chain of the product that I'm buying.
We're now seeing a real increase in the number of collaborations and partnerships, creating extraordinary coalitions and setting ambitious targets to get us on the right path in line with what the science is telling us.
Employees have a responsibility to demand a better value system from corporations, and that's one way to pressure leaders to take a stand and say that they're going to be committed to the environment.
It just comes down to all leaders of all organizations recognizing far-reaching implications for how this can truly help to have an impact in the world.
Never compromise. What you're doing today will have an impact on the planet for thousands and thousands of years.
There has been no species that has been remotely clever or ingenious than Homo sapiens. Let us live up to that name. We need wisdom to actually find the solution, and then courage to back it.
So some fairly sobering messages in that video. I'm sure many of those issues are topics that you're familiar with. And what I'm here to do today is just to talk about, well, what do we need to do? We know the scale of the challenge. And so how can we accelerate the solutions into the spaces that we need? So if I talk first about what we just heard on the video. Since 1950, we've seen these great accelerations in almost every indicator on our planet, from energy use, fertilizer consumption, whether it's tourism and travel. And we've seen how this has had an almost exponential impact on almost every aspect of our planetary system. The amount of carbon dioxide we have in the planet, the sea surface temperature, ocean acidification, methane, the loss of our biosphere, tropical forest loss of coral reefs. So the challenge and the science are fairly clear on the scale of the challenge. This is a global issue that will take a lot of momentum. And if we look at the planet, many scientists have talked about the 9 planetary boundaries within which we have to live. And these cover things like the amount of carbon that we have in our atmosphere, species diversity, the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus, ocean acidification. And these are the 9 parameters we need for this very stable, what we call Holocene period, this Goldilocks zone where the Earth is neither too warm, neither too cold, in a very stable situation. And we've been like this for about 10 to 15 million years. But already in the last 50 years, we've now exceeded 4 of these 9 boundary conditions. The amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide is now at 410 parts per million. The extinction rate, others have talked about being on this precipice of a 6th mass extinction. The way we use our land, the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, just for agriculture, for example. We produce more nitrogen through fertilizers for agriculture than exists in nature. So that's just the scale of what's being produced. And for 2 of the other 9, we don't even know what the safe operating levels are. So novel entities like plastics, microplastics, some of the chemicals like PCBs that were used for cooling in the 1960s. We're still trying to understand the implications there. And atmospheric aerosol loading, the amount of particles that we have in places like India or China or Indonesia. We know the impacts on humans, but we're still just starting to understand the impacts on plants and animals. So we are in a fairly serious situation scientifically. So economically, what does this mean in terms of the scale of the economic challenge? Well, the Marshall Plan, 1948 to 1951, at the time cost about $12 billion. In today's price, that's about $100 billion in terms of the recovery from the Second World War to Europe. The New Deal in 1933 was about $65 billion in 1933 prices. That's $650 billion today. To transition to a zero carbon economy and stay within some of these safe operating parameters, it's estimated that we will need $2 trillion over the next decade by 2030. So that's about $200 billion a year in order to stay within this what's called 1.5 degrees Celsius parameter. The scale of financing is important, but also being smart about how we finance is going to be equally important. Some of the banks are already transitioning. We have, just 2 weeks ago, banks worth $47 trillion, or in terms of the balance sheet, have made commitments towards sustainable banking. Several governments through the United Nations have launched a task force to explore financial technologies. But the truth of the matter is that governments are moving too slowly. Traditional banks are moving too slowly. And so one of the big solutions of agility and where solutions could lie for the planet could be in the fintech space. So at the World Economic Forum, we look at 6 areas on how new technologies are disrupting financial services. These are insurance and risk, looking at things like insurance disaggregation, connected insurance, deposits and lending as consumer preferences shift, new forms of capital raising, investment management, market provisioning, so that's new market platforms, algorithmic trading, and new payment technologies. And so if any of you are working in these are areas that could have a potentially disruptive impact on climate and sustainability financing. So just to bring to life some of the examples, We can see, for example, in terms of microinsurance, right now it's extremely challenging to insure whether it's fishermen or farmers who are living on very fragile existences. But as the planet and the ocean in particular become more and more volatile, we need to develop new insurance mechanisms to de-risk some of their lifestyles. Alternative lending, when you start to look at whether it's illegal forestry, how can we start to attract lending to commodities or farmers who are operating in a more sustainable manner? Capital raising for environmental projects. One of the big challenges in the environmental space is that a lot of these technologies are high risk. So how do we accelerate these technologies to move from laboratories into the real world? The traditional capital raising markets and venture capital is still not going there in sufficient volume. So could fintech be a solution for innovative capital raising projects? ESG investments, I'm sure many of you are involved in this sector, but we now see those who are under 35, about a third of their portfolio are in ESG investments compared to less than 5% of those over 50 years old. And so as we start to see this growing consciousness around ESG, which is growing at 20% year on year, how can we start to identify the right sort of indices? And I know there was a presenter before me on provenance tracking, but how do we look at provenance and link this to better environmental, social, and governance outcomes? Traceability solutions. The parameters I gave you around the planet, these are our carbon budgets, our biodiversity budgets, our nitrogen budgets. So things like cap and trade, where we can actually cap the amount that's needed in the planet, but then start trading this. How do we look at new provenance around carbon, where our seafood is caught, some of the commodities like forestry? How do we ensure that some of those solutions are from a sustainable source and we can actually track the provenance from them? And more agile payments. 70% of those who will be affected on the planet currently earn less than $5,000 per capita. So when we look at the next 30 years, we look at the growth of Global South, how can we start to ensure the right sort of payments can impact those from India, from China, the growing 3 billion middle class that will enter this world? So what do we hope success could look like? The last few industrial revolutions have seen us loss of biodiversity, these challenges to the planet that we've seen around the world. And we hope with some of your support, some of the products that you can develop through the fintech industry, can we not just stop the decline, but also restore our planet to a healthy planetary health. And so with that, we've got a book out on some of these topics, and you can reach me on this email, but I'm happy to take some questions on climate finance. Thank you.
Nishan, and I think I'll let you hold that spot there, because I think you used three very important words. You said wisdom, solution, and courage, right? It was also part of your video, and I think this is so important, and let's give the audience some chance to ask you some questions, and I know you'll be around as well, but please raise your hand and we'll get the mic over to you. I'll walk over right there.
Thank you. Interesting statistics on the New Deal and the Marshall Plan. Are there any statistics on the returns of those plans to be able to better frame up what the opportunity is of these investments that are needed for Green Deal or climate capitalism?
Yeah, so what's interesting over here is that we need to create completely new markets in certain areas. So the one that's risen to attention over the last few years has been plastics, single-use plastics. If you look at just disrupting the single-use plastics supply chain, that's over $100 billion in terms of packaging that's used every year. So some of the alternatives that's being developed, whether it's packaging from seaweed, for example, packaging from other sustainable source, more renewable recycling technologies through various chemical processes, you look at the market potential of disrupting all virgin plastic. And so those are the ways that we would look at where some of the returns are. In terms of some of the other areas, there's been a mixed set of results because of things like carbon trading. So in 2005, there was the first wave of clean tech returns, and then there's been all sorts of nuances in the market with a lot of solar panels entering the market from China at much lower cost. And so we see a spread of returns, but fundamentally, that as that transition happens over the next decade, and it'll either happen on market terms or non-market terms because it will be imposed on us, we see this as a extremely attractive market. If you look at whether it's electric vehicles or other solutions that's being explored, these will transform existing industries. So that's how I would be looking at the returns. I don't think you could look prescriptively at some of the existing industries and say it's a pure displacement. It's more to look at the disruption of the industry and the potential if we were to transition to those industries.
Thanks for that presentation. Do you see, you called about, talked about some money flowing, quite a bit of money flowing into the industry. Do you see also kind of our best and brightest talent going into climate technology? Or what do you think we need to do to be able to make that happen as a top priority?
No, so that's a great question. I think talent is core to this. So one of the things that's become more and more prominent has been the growth and the consciousness of whether we call it for-purpose or values-driven companies and organizations, whether it's linked to climate, environment, social considerations. And we're seeing a lot of big companies really struggling to attract talent unless they have that purpose-driven agenda. I think one of the, I think there's two facets to kind of the talent question. One is, are we talking about traditional talent and traditional ways of operating? And I think the second is, how do we think about new forms of organization that's going to be more purpose-driven in the future? So we need to increase the amount of returns that we are making in some of the climate investment fields, whether it's alternative battery technologies, energy productions, alternative materials. And they may not necessarily have the highest returns immediately as we are at the early stage of the growth, but we imagine that the market will be created. But it's also to recognize, I think, the second facet that a lot of talent, particularly the younger generation, are not just motivated by money. And so what are the other elements that they could be motivated by, and how can you develop a more purposeful organization that can fulfill their objectives? So I think it's a bit more of a subtle answer to your question. And those are some of the companies that I'm seeing who've been able to attract some of the best and brightest talent, who not just from an engineering perspective, but from an all-round value set perspective to develop kind of a more vibrant working environment. So I think purpose-driven workplaces are going to be an important value system of the future and may define capitalism. And Mark Benioff from Salesforce often talks about the new form of capitalism and how capitalism needs to be disrupted. And we're starting to see that more and more in the younger generations.
What would be a consumer a consumer roadmap for you? So I know I'm supposed to recycle.
Yep.
That's easy. Right? But I think the fintechs need some guidance as well, and so do the consumers. So if we create a market demand, you'll get fintech to fill the space. So what is the consumer roadmap that we should be doing as an owner of a house, right?
Yeah, it's, I don't want to be prescriptive on exactly the right elements, but if you just look at this chart, for example, these are all the elements that we will need to transform. Fundamentally, our planet, your children, your grandchildren, will have a fundamentally different way of living. Right? And I've done a lot of work in island states, and that's a reality now. At least 1/3 to 40% of the GDP of many of these countries are being threatened. If it was in the US, if 1/3 to 40% of the US GDP was threatened in the next 50 years, I think the US would react in a very different way. And it's not a federal or state, it's just a reality of how these challenges are affecting different countries. So there will need to be new methods in how we look at biodiversity. We cannot continue to extract forestry products the way we do, or beef. Some of the surprising factors that have emerged that nobody could have predicted from a kind of policy perspective has been how quickly the plastics movement has developed in the last 3 years. It went from a few tweets to all of a sudden this mass movement where almost any retail company are on the back foot. The other one is alternative proteins. Again, I've been at Davos now for 8 or 9 years, and we could not have forecast even 3 years ago how quickly alternatives like Impossible Burgers, meatless, and a range of other new wave foods, alternative proteins that have emerged. But essentially, these are the hard parameters that will affect our planet today, whether it's nitrogen, so we'll need more precision agriculture, whether it's how do we look at novel entities like plastics, certainly carbon, ocean acidification. And so there's a range of industries, each of whom have different roadmaps of what they would need to do to decarbonize. The Paris Agreement gives a headline number. Governments are moving too slowly to meet that. So there are some voluntary contributions in the shipping industry. So there's probably some enterprise solutions and some retail solutions.
Sorry, just one comment though. But I think the piece, and my wife's very well read on this, right? So I just do what she says. So she's the one you got to get to. She struggles to find what is a tactical next step that she as a consumer want to take in this industry. Because if you figure that out and help us create the demand, the fintechs will follow, right?
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like, this is all good stuff, but it's so high level, it's hard to it's hard to understand the implementation at a tactical level. So what are we doing about that?
And so this is where there needs to be a halfway discussion. So certainly the world that I'm in, I see a lot of greenwashing, a lot of statements that are that describe so-called ethical or sustainable solutions, but we're not able to track that down. And what was interesting was when China 2 years ago shut down accepting plastics into China. And all of a sudden there was a recognition, certainly in the US and other countries, that a lot of the recycling facilities were not in their own country. They were in China, and we were just relying and trusting that there'd be recycling plants there. So I think the halfway house is, how can the fintech industry also educate the scientists and other policymakers to say, look, we have new solutions like provenance tracking. When you are to dispose of your recycling, we can track that through and see if this does get recycled or turned to another product. How can we turn, for example, things like minerals, where a country would never sell a mineral, but will continue to own a mineral throughout its lifestyle? So I think in the US, like asbestos removals over here, you as a householder will continue to own your asbestos, whether it's disposed of in another site. Now, what is a fintech solution for countries at a larger scale with some of their resources to ensure that they have responsibility if a technology company like Intel or Cisco uses their components for a chip, that company is then responsible for collecting, recycling, and then making sure there's a circular economy. So I can't give you the silver bullet right now, but I think it is a halfway house where fintech say, look, here's a suite of solutions that could be applied. How could this be applied to solve some of these challenges? And that's maybe how we can meet that demand.
Yes, over here.
Yep, sorry.
Yeah. You had a photo there of a fisherman in seemed like a small country and kind of a microfinance area. So if you implemented blockchain and said these are sustainable fisheries, then that person there would probably I know blockchain has the capability of reaching that type of person, but those are pretty wide open markets, and they trade at lightning speed on a daily basis. Is that the type of accountability you think that can happen, or are you going to just stick with large countries, large volumes that you think is implementable over the next decade?
Yeah, so the range of solutions needed, some for the big countries, some for the small countries. I think one of the big disruptions to the economic system is around values, for example. So one of the challenges in seafood, you've probably read about 70 to 80% of our fisheries are overfished, mainly by industrial fisheries. And one of the reasons is the economic incentives. So there are 4 stages of a supply chain. So let's say tuna, that's typically sold for, let's say, $10 a kilo here in the 4 big markets of the US, China, Japan, and Europe. The countries themselves receive maybe 20 to 30 cents of that $10. The fishing companies, maybe $2 or $3. The processors, $2 or $3, 65% in Asia. And then about $6 goes to the big retailers or restaurants. And so when you're only receiving 20 to 30 cents a kilo, so a country like Mauritius would receive, let's say, $50 million, you don't have sufficient resources to actually manage and monitor and track. And so if there's a way to actually reframe fishing, that's just one example of how I would do it through blockchain, not just purely on a provenance level, but actually looking at where there's a higher value for more healthier and sustainable products. And what we've seen in the policy world is, while sustainability is important, whenever sustainability is linked to human health, we've been able to make a lot more traction. For example, on air quality emissions in China, or seafood when it comes to certain toxins that could be in seafood. So there may be a solution there on blockchain or provenance linked to human health on how you can incentivize higher values from those who are catching a more sustainable way.
And I think we'll take the last question. Can someone get the mic over to the gentleman?
It's,
I think, Nidhi, we're running out of time, yeah.
It seems to me that if we could develop a blockchain with an incentivized token, then you can incentivize people around the globe individually to reduce a footprint. So you create some sort of constant, a fungible token like water and plastic and carbon. And it airdrops around the world. So if the funding could be found to create that with the blockchain, now you can actually incentivize people globally, everybody, not just one individual industry like fishing, although you could come up with some sort of water pollution, fungible footprint reduction. And now you incentivize people by dropping in either or taking away a dividend, that token, from them. So if it actually hits them in terms of a benefit to what they do and how they reduce their footprint, or takes away when they exceed that footprint, that fungible number, whatever you want to call it, a gallon of water, for example, that could be a global solution rather than an individual industry solution.
So that's a great point, and it's equivalent of almost an advanced purchase order, where if you have solutions that can actually meet that demand. And I think you hit on another point as well. It's going to be extremely challenging for governments centrally, particularly in today's political environment, to agree to coordinate or have the right mechanisms to coordinate. So we do need decentralized mechanisms to operate in a much more agile way. So if there are solutions that you or your colleagues can think of, I think they are very applicable. And as you see with some of those numbers there, it's extremely, $2 trillion worth of transition that we need to go through in order to be on a more sustainable path. So it is an attractive opportunity. So I'd love to talk more about this afterwards. So I think we're out of time. I see Nidhi coming up to me.
Thank you so much, Nishan. I think this is a great conversation. Really appreciate it. And you will be around for a bit. So I know I have some questions. And I know you and we were talking earlier about an organization. And I think it was Amex that partnered with a company called Parlay. So it's basically ocean-friendly cards. And I do not work for Amex, but I was just sharing that article. But, it pretty much aligns with a lot of what you said. I think it's all of us doing something. It doesn't always have to be the bigger vision, but, the things that happen top down, bottom up. So thank you so much for this. You will be around
I'll be around,
lunch and so on, so please get hold of Nishan, and thank you once again. Ladies and gentlemen, please, a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.